What if one perfect gift, meant to fix everything, actually exposed the truth no one could ignore? This is the moment that changed everything in the Brown family. And trust me, you won't see it coming. So hit subscribe right now, because we break stories like this before anyone else, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Cody Brown believed he was about to change everything. He truly thought this was the moment that would flip the narrative, silence the critics, and finally prove that he was still the devoted father he always claimed to be. But what he did not realize was that this single decision would do the exact opposite and expose everything in a way he could never recover from. For months, the pressure had been building, fans watching closely, analyzing every move, every word, every expression, and the conclusion they were reaching was not in his favor. Accusations of favoritism, emotional distance, and selective parenting were growing louder and louder, and the situation was slipping out of his control, especially as more attention focused on how differently he treated Robin's household compared to his biological children. And that is where the panic started to set in, because image matters, especially when the cameras never stop rolling. So instead of addressing the deeper issues, something more calculated began to form. A plan not built on honesty, but on appearance. Something that could look meaningful without requiring real emotional effort. Something that could create a moment, a scene, a headline, a reaction. Something that could be edited into a perfect redemption arc. And that is when the idea of the so-called meaningful gift was born. Not just any gift, but something framed as deeply personal, something that would appear symbolic, something that could not be easily questioned. At least that was the assumption, because in his mind, this gesture would land perfectly. It would create emotion, it would create gratitude, it would create a moment that viewers would replay and say, maybe he really is trying, maybe he really does care. But that entire plan rested on one very dangerous assumption, that the person receiving it would not question, would not analyze it, would not look deeper. And that assumption was the beginning of everything falling apart. The preparation itself was almost theatrical. The way the item was selected, the way it was presented, the way the story behind it was crafted, every detail carefully shaped to create a narrative of legacy and meaning, something described as rare, something described as special, something meant to represent a connection that distance had supposedly not broken. And when it was finally sent, it carried more than just the object inside. It carried expectation, it carried intention, it carried a carefully constructed illusion. But what happened next was not part of the script, because the reaction was not what had been imagined. There were no emotional tears, there was no immediate gratitude, there was no validation of the story that had been so carefully built. Instead, there was recognition, awareness, and something far more powerful: clarity. Because the person receiving it was not the same as before. No longer someone who would simply accept what was presented without question. No longer someone unaware of the bigger picture. Instead, someone who had grown, someone who had observed, someone who understood patterns and behavior. And that is where everything changed. Because instead of reacting emotionally, there was a pause, a moment of evaluation, a moment where the reality behind the gesture began to surface. And once that happened, the illusion could not hold together anymore. The story behind the item began to unravel, piece by piece, and what was supposed to be meaningful started to look something else entirely, something far less sincere, something that raised questions instead of answering them. And in that moment, the entire purpose of the gesture collapsed, because it was no longer about what was given, but about what it represented and what it revealed. And that is when the deeper realization began to form. This was never really about connection. It was about perception. It was about control. It was about creating a version of reality that could be shown to the world, regardless of what actually existed beneath the surface. And that realization carried weight because it connected to a larger pattern, something that had been building over time, something that could no longer be ignored: the imbalance, the distance, the selective attention. It all started to align into a clearer picture, and the more it was examined, the harder it became to dismiss. And that is what made this moment so significant. It was not just a single event. It was a reflection of everything that had come before it, a turning point where the narrative could no longer be controlled in the same way. And as that understanding grew, so did the impact. Because once a pattern is recognized, it becomes impossible to overlook. And once awareness sets in, it changes how every future action is perceived. And that is exactly where things began to shift. Because this was no longer about proving anything to an audience. It was about confronting a reality that had been avoided for far too long. And that is what made the silence that followed so powerful. Because sometimes the absence of a reaction speaks louder than any words ever could. It creates space for reflection. It removes the distraction of emotion, and it forces the truth to stand on its own. And in that space, the weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. The gesture that was meant to repair instead revealed the cracks more clearly than ever before. And the attempt to control the narrative instead allowed it to slip further out of reach. And that is the irony at the center of it all. The more something is constructed to appear authentic without truly being so, the easier it becomes to see through. And once that happens, there is no easy way to rebuild, because trust is not restored through performance. It is rebuilt through consistency, through effort, through actions that align with words over time. And that is where the real challenge begins, because recognizing a problem is only the first step. Addressing it requires something much deeper, something that cannot be staged or edited, something that requires accountability and change. And as this moment continues to unfold, the question becomes whether that step will ever be taken, or whether the pattern will continue repeating itself in different forms. Because at the end of the day, the audience is watching. But more importantly, the people directly involved are experiencing it in real time. And their understanding of the situation is shaped not by what is presented, but by what is consistently shown. And that is what gives this moment its lasting impact. It is not just about what happened, it is about what it reveals and what it suggests about everything that may come next. As the reality of that moment settled in, the carefully constructed illusion could no longer hold together, because what was once presented as meaningful had now been quietly redefined as something hollow. And that shift did not need loud confrontation or dramatic words to make its impact. It was already clear in the silence, in the lack of reaction, in the absence of the response that had been expected. And that is what made it so powerful. Because when a gesture designed to create emotion instead creates distance, it forces a deeper level of reflection, one that cannot be avoided or easily dismissed. And as that realization spread, it did not remain contained to a single moment. It began to ripple outward, influencing how everything else was viewed. Every past interaction, every perceived imbalance, every moment that once seemed small now carried new meaning. And the pattern that had been forming in the background became impossible to ignore, because it was no longer just about one decision. It was about a series of choices that had led to this point. And that is where the narrative began to shift in a way that could not be controlled. Because once people start connecting the dots, they begin to see the bigger picture. And when that happens, the focus moves away from isolated incidents and toward the underlying behavior that connects them. And that is exactly what unfolded here. The gesture that was supposed to rebuild instead became a reference point, a moment that highlighted the difference between intention and authenticity. And as more attention was drawn to it, the conversation naturally evolved from what happened to why it happened. And that question carried far more weight, because it required an honest evaluation of priorities, of effort, of consistency, and of the gap between what is said and what is shown. And that gap is where trust either grows or breaks down. And in this case, it became increasingly clear that the foundation had already been weakened long before this moment ever took place. And that is why the response did not need to be dramatic to be impactful. It simply needed to be clear. And once that clarity was established, everything else followed naturally. The perception shifted. the narrative expanded, and the ability to reshape the story through presentation alone became more limited than ever before. Because authenticity cannot be recreated once it has been questioned. It has to be demonstrated over time through consistent actions, and that is a much more difficult process than creating a single moment designed to appear meaningful. And as this understanding continued to settle in, it also began to influence the broader dynamic, because situations like this do not exist in isolation. They affect relationships, they affect communication, and they affect the way future actions are interpreted. And that is where the long-term impact begins to take shape. Because once trust is challenged, every new interaction is viewed through a different lens, one that is more observant, more cautious, and less willing to accept things at face value. And that shift is not easily reversed because it is built on experience, not assumption. And that is what makes it so significant, because it represents a turning point, not just in how one moment is seen, but in how everything moving forward will be understood. And as that shift continues to develop, it raises an important question about what comes next, because recognizing a pattern is only the beginning. Addressing it requires something more. It requires consistency. It requires effort, and it requires a willingness to move beyond surface-level gestures and engage in something more genuine. And that is where the real challenge lies, because it is one thing to create a moment that appears meaningful, but it is another to build a pattern of behavior that consistently reflects that meaning over time. And that difference is what ultimately defines whether a relationship strengthens or continues to drift further apart. And as this situation continues to unfold, that distinction becomes And just like that, one moment revealed everything that had been hidden in plain sight, proving that actions will always speak louder than any carefully planned gesture. If you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe right now, because the next story is even bigger and you do not want to miss it.